If you killed every single cow on planet Earth, all 1.6 billion of them, gone overnight, global temperature would drop by 4/100ths of a degree. Not 4 degrees, not 4/10ths of a degree, 4/100ths. A number so small that most thermometers hanging on your kitchen wall couldn't even register it. And yet, for the better part of the last decade, cattle have been positioned as one of the great villains of climate change. Documentaries have been built around them. Diet recommendations have cited them. Entire policy proposals in wealthy countries have targeted them by name. So either the science behind that 4/100ths of a degree number is wrong, or something else is going on. Let's look at the actual numbers, one at a time, and let you decide for yourself. Start with where that number even comes from. It's not a guess, and it's not a talking point invented for a video like this one. It comes from a published climate calculation that modeled what would happen to the planet's temperature if every cow currently alive vanished instantly, along with every unit of methane they would have ever produced. The researchers behind it ran the same calculation for sheep. Killing every sheep on Earth, all 1.3 billion of them, would shave off about 4/1000ths of a degree. 4/1000ths. That's not a typo, and it's not a rounding error either. It's the actual scale of the number once you do the math, honestly, using the same physics that climate scientists use everywhere else. Now, here's where it gets more interesting, because this same team looked at a real-world policy, not just a hypothetical mass extinction event. New Zealand, a country whose economy leans heavily on cattle and sheep farming, set an official national target to cut livestock methane emissions somewhere between 14 and 24% below what they were in 2017. That's not a fantasy number. That's an actual law, an actual target, with actual farmers being asked to actually change what they do. And if New Zealand hits that target completely, on time, with full compliance, the effect on global temperature would be somewhere between 5/10 millionths and 8/10 millionths of a degree. To put that in plain language, too small to measure. Not too small to notice, too small to measure, using our best instruments, our best models, our best methods. A number so far below the threshold of detection that scientists themselves describe it, in their own words, as being all pain, no gain. So why does this keep happening? Why do we keep hearing that cattle are driving the climate crisis when the actual physics says that removing every cow and sheep on the planet combined would move the needle by less than 5/100ths of a degree? To answer that, we need to understand what methane actually is, how it behaves in the atmosphere, and why it gets treated so differently from the thing that's actually driving almost all of the warming we're experiencing. Methane is a real greenhouse gas. Nobody credible disputes that. Molecule for molecule, it traps far more heat than carbon dioxide does. That part of the story is completely true, and any script that tells you methane doesn't matter at all would be lying to you. But here's the part that gets left out constantly, the part that changes the entire picture once you understand it. Methane doesn't behave like carbon dioxide once it's in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, once released, can stick around for centuries, in some cases for thousands of years, slowly accumulating layer upon layer, decade after decade, like sediment building up at the bottom of a lake. Methane does something completely different. It breaks down. Within roughly a decade, most of it has already converted into carbon dioxide and water vapor through a natural chemical process in the atmosphere. 12 years, and it's essentially gone as methane. That distinction matters enormously, and here's why. If a source of methane stays roughly constant year after year, if a cattle herd, for example, produces about the same amount of methane in 2026 as it did in 2016 and the same as it did in 2006, then the methane being destroyed every year is roughly equal to the methane being produced every year. It's a cycle in balance. Old methane breaks down, new methane replaces it, and the total amount sitting in the atmosphere from that source stays roughly flat. That is fundamentally different from what happens when you burn coal, oil, or gas. Fossil fuels are exactly what the name implies. Carbon that has been locked underground for millions of years, sequestered away from the atmosphere entirely. And burning it adds brand new carbon into the system that would never have gotten there naturally, at least not on any time scale that matters to a human being. There is no balance happening there. There is no cycle. It's a one-way deposit into the atmosphere's account. And every year we keep making that deposit. The balance keeps growing. The planet keeps warming. Think about it the way you'd think about a bathtub. Carbon dioxide from fossil fuels is like a faucet that's permanently turned on, pouring water into the tub, while the drain barely works at all. Every year that faucet runs, the water level rises a little more, and it keeps rising for centuries because the drain can't keep pace with the tap. Methane from a stable cattle herd is a completely different kind of faucet. It's pouring water in, sure, but the drain underneath it is working just as fast as the tap, because methane breaks down roughly as quickly as the herd produces it, assuming the herd isn't growing. The water level in that particular section of the tub stays roughly where it's always been. Two faucets, two very different outcomes, and yet in most conversations about climate change, they get treated as if they're identical, as if a gallon poured from one faucet is exactly the same as a gallon poured from the other. It isn't, and understanding that difference is the single most important thing to hold on to as we keep going. A cow, on the other hand, is part of a loop that was already running long before climate change became a headline. The cow eats grass. That grass pulled its carbon directly out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, days or weeks earlier. The cow digests that grass, and through a process called enteric fermentation, some of that carbon comes back out as methane. And within about a decade, that methane breaks down and returns to being carbon dioxide, the same carbon dioxide the grass originally pulled from the air. The loop closes. As long as the number of cattle on the planet, or at least in a given country, isn't dramatically increasing year over year, that loop stays roughly balanced, and the herd isn't adding new warming on top of what's already there. It's recycling carbon that was already in circulation. This is not a fringe idea invented to defend the beef industry. It's the reasoning behind an entirely different way of measuring greenhouse gas impact called GWP*, developed by climate scientists, specifically because they recognized that the standard accounting method, the one used in almost every headline you've ever read, treats a steady, unchanging source of methane as if it behaves exactly like a steady, unchanging source of carbon dioxide. And it doesn't. Under that standard method, called GWP 100, methane gets converted into a carbon dioxide equivalent by multiplying it by a fixed number, usually around 28, based on its warming potential averaged out over 100 years. That math makes sense if you're comparing a single, one-time release of both gases. But apply that same multiplier to a herd of cattle that has existed at roughly the same size for 50 years, and you start to imply that herd is causing 50 years of accumulating, compounding warming in the same way a coal plant running for 50 years would be. It isn't. The physics doesn't support that comparison, at least not for a stable population. GWP* tries to correct for that distortion, and when scientists run the numbers using that corrected method, livestock's actual contribution to new additional warming looks dramatically smaller than the number you'll see quoted in most news coverage. Now, let's bring this back down to ground level, because abstract atmospheric chemistry is one thing, but actual cattle numbers are another, and this is where the story gets even harder to reconcile with the narrative you've probably heard. In the United States, beef cow numbers peaked all the way back in 1975. That's half a century ago. Since then, the herd has shrunk, plateaued, shrunk. Again, today sits at levels similar to where it was in the early 1960s. Dairy cow numbers tell an even more dramatic story. They peaked in 1945, right after World War II, and have been declining pretty much continuously ever since, to the point where American dairy herds are now at their lowest levels in over 100 years. Meanwhile, over that same stretch of decades, milk and beef production per animal has actually climbed thanks to better breeding, better feed, and better veterinary care, meaning the country has been producing roughly the same amount of food, or more, from a shrinking number of animals. That's the opposite pattern you'd expect if livestock were somehow driving an accelerating climate emergency. A driving cause of a worsening problem should be getting bigger over time, not smaller, and American cattle simply aren't. So sit with that for a second. If American cattle herds have been flat or shrinking for the better part of a century, and if a stable herd means a stable, balanced methane cycle rather than a growing one, then it becomes very difficult to argue that American cattle are the driving force behind a climate crisis that has clearly gotten worse over that exact same window of time. The math doesn't support the story. Something else has to be doing the heavy lifting, and every serious measurement points to the same culprit: fossil fuels. Coal, oil, and natural gas combustion for electricity, transportation, heating, and industry dwarf agricultural methane in terms of total climate impact. And unlike a stable cattle herd, fossil fuel emissions have been climbing globally for decades, adding brand new carbon into the atmosphere with no natural mechanism to pull it back out on any relevant timescale. But here's where I want to be careful, because this isn't a video telling you cattle are innocent and blameless and that none of this matters. That would be just as dishonest as the narrative it's pushing back against. The full picture is more complicated, and a fair examination has to include the parts that complicate the cattle are basically harmless argument too. Globally, the picture is not nearly as flat as it is in the United States. While American herds have shrunk, livestock populations in other parts of the world have expanded, and global data from agricultural monitoring bodies shows that emissions from enteric fermentation and manure management actually rose over the past decade, with increases in both categories tracked between 2015 and 2020 alone. That's not a stable, balanced loop. That's a growing source, and under any accounting method, a growing source of methane does add new warming, because the amount breaking down each year is less than the amount being newly produced. So the "it's just a balanced cycle" defense works much better as an explanation for the United States and other countries with flat or shrinking herds than it does as a blanket statement about global livestock as a whole. There's also the question of methane's short-term punch. Yes, it breaks down faster than carbon dioxide, but while it's up there, it's doing serious work. Methane is responsible for a significant chunk of the warming we're already experiencing right now, today, contributing to the heat waves, the wildfires, and the droughts that are becoming more frequent and more severe in real time. Because it acts fast and breaks down fast, cutting methane emissions today produces a cooling effect within years, not centuries, which is part of why cutting methane is often described by scientists, even ones who aren't remotely hostile to agriculture, as one of the fastest, cheapest levers available for slowing near-term warming. That's a real, legitimate reason for policymakers to care about livestock methane specifically, separate from any broader argument about who's really to blame for the climate crisis as a whole. There's also a regional wrinkle worth mentioning, because climate conversations happen at a global level, but real farms exist in specific places, under specific rules, with specific incentives. Countries with rapidly expanding livestock sectors, often in parts of the developing world where demand for meat and dairy is rising alongside population and income growth, look completely different on paper than a country like the United States with a flat or shrinking herd. In those fast-growing regions, the balanced cycle argument doesn't hold nearly as well because the herd itself is getting bigger year over year, which means new methane is being added faster than old methane is breaking down. A blanket statement like "cattle don't affect the climate" simply doesn't survive contact with that kind of regional data. The honest version of this story has to hold two things at once. A mature, stable herd in a wealthy country behaves very differently, climate-wise, than a rapidly expanding herd in a country still building out its agricultural base and treating every cow on the planet as functionally identical everywhere, in every country, is its own kind of oversimplification. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a picture that's genuinely more nuanced than either extreme version of the story. It is true and well documented that killing every cow and sheep on the planet would barely move global temperature at all, 0.04 of a degree, an amount too small for most of us to ever feel or notice. It is true that a stable cattle herd, like the one in the United States, behaves more like a balanced biological cycle than an open tap constantly adding new carbon to the atmosphere, and that comparing it directly to fossil fuel combustion, ton for ton using standard accounting methods, may significantly overstate its true long-term climate impact. It is also true that, globally, livestock populations are growing in many regions, which means agricultural methane as a whole is still rising rather than staying flat, that even short-lived gases like methane are doing real measurable damage while they're in the atmosphere. Both of those things can be true at the same time. The number gets exaggerated in some conversations and dismissed too easily in others, and the honest answer sits somewhere in between, closer to cattle are a smaller piece of the puzzle than the headlines suggest, than to cattle are the primary driver of the crisis. Which brings us to the real question this video is actually trying to answer. If the physics doesn't support cattle being one of the central villains of climate change, why does that framing keep showing up over and over in documentaries, in news segments, in public health guidance, in corporate sustainability pledges? Is there a deliberate, coordinated agenda behind it? Some hidden hand steering the conversation toward cows for reasons that have nothing to do with climate science? Or is something simpler, messier, and honestly more human going on? Here's the more grounded explanation, and it doesn't require a secret conspiracy to make sense. Cattle are an easy villain because they're visible, tangible, and emotionally simple in a way that the global energy grid, or 100 years of industrial infrastructure, simply isn't. You can picture a cow. You can put a cow on a magazine cover. You can film a cow burping in slow motion with ominous music behind it. And within 30 seconds, an audience understands the story you're telling, even if the underlying science is far more complicated than that 30-second clip suggests. Nobody gets that same visceral, immediate reaction from a photo of a natural gas compressor station or a coal-fired power plant's cooling tower, even though those sources are doing dramatically more damage, year after year, than a stable national cattle herd ever could. Complexity doesn't sell headlines. A cow burping does. Think about how differently these two stories actually get told. A cow is a single, identifiable creature, something a child can draw, something with a face. An electrical grid is a sprawling, invisible network of transformers, transmission lines, substations, and combustion turbines spread across an entire continent, built up over more than a century by thousands of different companies, regulated by hundreds of different agencies, tangled into every single part of how modern life functions. You cannot photograph the grid in a way that produces an emotional reaction the way a photograph of a cow can. You cannot personally opt out of the grid the way you can personally opt out of a hamburger. That asymmetry between what's easy to visualize and what's actually driving the problem shapes an enormous amount of what ends up in headlines, documentaries, and dinner table conversations, almost entirely independent of which one is actually more important to fix. There's also a structural economic reality underneath all of this that's worth naming plainly, without turning it into some grand conspiracy theory. Individual dietary choices are something a person can act on immediately, without waiting for a government, a utility company, or an entire national grid to change. Telling someone to eat less beef feels actionable in a way that telling them to personally overhaul the electrical grid never will. That makes livestock an attractive target for campaigns, guidance, and messaging aimed at individual consumers. Not necessarily because it's the most impactful lever available, but because it's the most personally controllable one. That's a real dynamic, and it's worth understanding, but it's different from claiming that scientists, journalists, or policymakers are secretly working together to mislead the public. Most of the people repeating the 14.5% figure or the cows are as bad as cars comparison genuinely believe it, because that's the number they were handed, and it sounded credible enough not to question. And that 14.5% figure deserves its own moment here, because it's probably the single most repeated statistic in this entire conversation. And it comes from a specific report published back in 2013, a report that has been challenged pretty extensively by researchers since then. Critics of that number argue it was built using accounting choices that inflate livestock's apparent share of total global emissions, particularly around how land use and comparisons to other sectors were handled. That doesn't mean livestock emissions are a myth, and the same researchers pushing back on that particular figure still argue enteric methane reduction matters and should be pursued seriously through tools like methane-reducing feed additives and breeding programs aimed at selecting naturally lower methane cattle, both of which have shown real, measurable promise in early trials. But it does mean one of the most widely cited numbers in this entire debate has a much shakier foundation than most people repeating it seem to realize, and that foundation rarely makes it into the headline itself. So what actually moves the needle, if it isn't a wholesale rejection of livestock? The research points towards something far less dramatic than stop eating beef, and far more practical, reduce emissions per animal rather than eliminating animals altogether. That includes feed additives, some derived from seaweed, that measurably cut the amount of methane a cow produces during digestion without requiring any change to herd size at all. It includes selective breeding programs aimed at identifying and propagating cattle that naturally produce less methane relative to their size and productivity, a trait that appears to be genuinely heritable. It includes better manure management, which addresses a smaller but still meaningful slice of agricultural methane. None of these solutions require mass culling, and none of them require abandoning livestock farming as an industry. They require targeted, technical improvement, the same kind of engineering mindset that's been applied to every other major industry, trying to reduce its footprint without shutting itself down entirely. Early field trials of some of these seaweed-based additives have shown methane reductions in the range of a third or more per animal without hurting the animal's health or productivity, which is a genuinely significant number when you multiply it across an entire national herd. Selective breeding, meanwhile, works on a slower timeline, but it compounds. Once you've identified cattle that naturally produce less methane while maintaining the same weight gain and milk output, those traits get passed down, generation after generation, the same way breeders have shaped cattle for size, temperament, and productivity for centuries. Neither of these approaches requires a single fewer burger sold or a single fewer glass of milk poured. They're supply-side engineering fixes, quietly implemented at the farm level, and they represent exactly the kind of unglamorous technical progress that almost never makes it into a headline, because there's no dramatic before and after image to go along with it. Compare that to the scale of change required in the energy sector, where the actual bulk of global emissions originates, and the imbalance in public attention becomes even harder to justify. Electricity generation, transportation, and heavy industry combined dwarf agriculture's total climate footprint many times over. And unlike a stable cattle herd cycling carbon that was already in the air, those sectors are still overwhelmingly powered by fossil fuels that pull carbon out of the ground and inject it permanently into the atmosphere. If you wanted to build a video, a campaign, or a policy platform around whatever has the largest, fastest, most measurable impact on slowing warming, cattle would not be anywhere near the top of that list. And yet cattle get a disproportionate share of the public conversation, the guilt, and the messaging aimed directly at individual consumers. That gap between where the science actually points and where the public conversation actually lands is the real story here, not a secret plot, not a hidden hand pulling strings behind the scenes, just a predictable, very human pattern. Simple, visible, emotionally resonant targets get more attention than complicated, invisible, structurally embedded ones, even when the complicated target is doing dramatically more damage. Cattle are simple. A cow is something you can picture, something you can blame, something you can personally opt out of at your next meal. The global energy grid is none of those things. It's abstract, distributed across 100 different industries and 100 different countries, built into the infrastructure of daily life in ways that no single consumer choice can meaningfully undo. So it's easier, psychologically and politically, to point at the cow. None of this means you should ignore agricultural methane entirely, or dismiss every article that mentions cattle and climate change in the same sentence as some kind of propaganda. The research is real, the mechanisms are real, and there are genuine practical ways to reduce livestock's environmental footprint that scientists across the political spectrum broadly agree are worth pursuing. What it does mean is that the scale of the blame placed on cattle, relative to the scale of their actual measurable impact, is badly out of proportion. And that gap didn't happen by accident. It happened because complicated structural problems make for bad headlines, and simple, visible ones make for great ones. A cow burping in slow motion is a better 30-second video than a chart showing global fossil fuel consumption climbing steadily for the last 100 years. That's not a conspiracy. That's just how attention works, how media incentives work, and how easy it is for a genuinely small number, like 0.04 of a degree, to get buried under a much louder, much simpler story. It's also worth asking what gets lost when the public conversation stays fixated on cattle instead of moving toward the sources doing the real damage. Every hour spent debating whether beef should be taxed, restricted, or shamed out of the average diet is an hour not spent scrutinizing, permitting delays for clean energy projects, not spent pushing utilities to retire coal plants faster, not spent holding fossil fuel producers accountable for methane leaks from their own pipelines and wellheads, which, ironically, are a large and genuinely underreported source of atmospheric methane in their own right. If the goal is actually slowing warming as quickly and effectively as possible, attention is a finite resource, and every unit of it spent on the wrong target is a unit not spent solving the parts of the problem that would actually move the number. So the next time you see a headline blaming cattle for the climate crisis, or seeing beef listed as one of the biggest things you personally need to cut out to save the planet, remember the actual math. Removing every cow and every sheep on Earth combined moves the global temperature by less than 0.05 of a degree. American cattle herds have been flat or shrinking for 50 to 80 years, which means, according to the same physics used everywhere else in climate science, they aren't the ones adding new warming to the system the way fossil fuels are. The real driver, the one responsible for the overwhelming majority of the warming we're actually experiencing, is still the same one it's always been: the extraction and combustion of coal, oil, and natural gas, happening at a scale that dwarfs agriculture many times over every single year, with no natural cycle in place to pull that carbon back out. That doesn't mean agriculture gets a free pass, and it doesn't mean every farmer, scientist, or policymaker working on livestock methane is wasting their time. Reducing methane, wherever it comes from, still helps, because it acts fast, and it's one of the few climate levers that can produce measurable cooling within years rather than decades. But when you're deciding where your attention, your concern, and your energy should go, if you actually care about slowing climate change, the data is pretty clear about where the real weight sits. It's not with the cow in the field. It's with the power plant, the pipeline, and the tailpipe, quietly outweighing agriculture year after year, largely unnoticed, while the cow keeps getting the blame. Look at the numbers yourself, follow where they actually lead, and decide what deserves your attention from there. Not because someone told you to, not because a slow-motion clip of a burping cow made you feel something, but because you actually did the math, the same math anyone can check for themselves in an afternoon. And it led you somewhere quieter, more honest, and far less convenient for a headline.